Welcome to Surviving Society.
Welcome to the final episode of the Poetics of Revolution. In this episode, I chat with Dr. Jackquelin Frost. Jack is a poet and historian and currently based at the University of Paris, London. Her articles have appeared in the Global South, a Bulletin of Francophone Postcolonial Studies, Historical Materialism and Third Text. And she's currently finishing a book on anti-colonial figures, one of whom is Jean Genet. So, Jack, what prompted you to start working on and thinking with Genet?
So the first book of Genet's that I read was called The Balcony, which is one of his 5 plays. And it was given to me by a poet called Brian Kim Steffens, who lives in LA, who teaches at UCLA, and I was living in Oakland at the time. The Balcony is about a brothel in which men come to play out their fantasies of authority. So you have men coming into the brothel to pretend to be policemen or pretend to be a judge or pretend to be a soldier or these kind of virile figures. Outside of the brothel, there's a revolution that's going on. The revolutionaries are sort of as ridiculous as the men who are coming into the brothel. And they're looking for a symbol, a feminine symbol, galvanize their revolution. And so I was really interested in Genet's critique of kind of revolutionary imagery and symbolism and the way that he was able to undercut pseudo-heroic aspects of these kind of images. And I thought that I would work on Genet alongside people like Monique Wittig or other sort of queer figures in the French 20th century canon. That was my intention. And then getting to grad school at Cornell, I decided to work more on the anti-colonial tradition of which he's also a part. And so he became included in a constellation of figures that included Césaire, Fanon, De Peste, Genet. Genet also included Charles, Léris, other people like that. That was how I came to work on his play on the Algerian Revolution called The Screens, and then to interest myself in his work on the Panthers and the Palestinians.
I maybe want to ask you a little bit more about this idea of Genet as a revolutionary who's kind of making fun of the revolution as well. Would you say, as some have read him, to be mostly an agent provocateur or just somebody trying to stir shit as opposed to actually a figure of the sort of left anti-colonial queer revolution?
Yeah, I would say that there's different periods of Genet, firstly. So I think that the period of his playwriting is one in which he is not at all committed to any particular struggle, though he's interested in the problem, those who are marginal to society, as someone who himself is marginal to society. But I think that he doesn't take seriously the sort of heroic aspects of the revolutionary. And that's true even with the Panthers, because I think that what interests him is not their power, but rather their powerlessness. And I think that this is what is the key to understanding why Genet is particularly fascinated with the Panthers and the Palestinians and later with the RAF and these other groups, is because they are fighting against an enemy who's vastly more powerful. Their struggle is therefore desperate and in a certain way absurd. But the beauty of that absurdity is something that Genet is extremely interested in, because I think he believes it to be much more true than those who find themselves on the side of power in whatever context, whether that's an anti-colonial struggle or, a queer or feminist struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is something to be said about how Genet moves from sort of the aesthetic and the representational aspects of immiseration, if you like, to trying to inhabit that. And that's something he continues to battle with. But he does come out quite forcefully for those he represents. And I think he's got lots of criticism for it, especially on his writings on violence and the piece on the Red Army faction that you just mentioned. And he's been called a terrorist sympathizer. I suppose his writings also on the Fedayeen would today be interpreted as advocating violence or terrorism. Given that we're living in the context of a live-streamed, televised genocide, how do we make sense of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Genet's moment, if we're thinking about 1970, 1971, where a lot of his writings on the Palestinians are first sort of formed. He writes he continues to write about the Palestinians in, throughout the 1970s, but these kind of initial texts where he is in Jordan visiting the bases and these kind of things. I think that reading those texts, what you get from his sense of things is that there is a form of camaraderie and friendship that people discuss very widely in relationship to all partisan struggles. So I think that for Genet, what the Palestinian resistance looks like is the same as like a partisan or a maquisard or a guerrilla struggle, right? That there is no difference between those things. And I think that the question of terrorism is something that, is a label that is being used. But I think that at the time, the force of such a label did not yet exist, right? We don't yet have the question of how terrorism is being dealt with on the international level among international organizations in different nation states. So I think there's still, at least in this 1970, 1972 period, the difference between the resistance and the terrorism or what have you is still very much up for grabs. But the forms of life that are coming into existence through the formation of the armed resistance is something that Genet is particularly interested in. And I think what fascinates him is really that, and this is true of the Panthers as well, he believes in revolt because revolt produces beauty, essentially. And we can think of this as a sort of silly aesthetic, idea. But I think for Genet, this is very serious, right? That the capacity of the revolt and the resistance to produce beauty is something that he's very attached to and that he believes in very strongly. And so I think that, whether that is, terrorism to someone else doesn't really matter. He believes that the revolt is born of a poetic vision. He says this like in all of the texts on the Panthers and the Palestinians, and that the revolt itself produces the new or the beautiful. In relation to the army, like the Red Army faction, I think he's concerned with the desperation and the lucidity of the people involved, right? That for him, there's a relationship between that desperation and some kind of like deep understanding or deep truth about the situation. And he says it, there's a certain plainness or simplicity or transparency. Like these are all the regimes with which he describes the Palestinians, right? The way they speak, the things they do. There's a sort of transparent truth to everything that they, to all the ways that they live and are together. And so I think that these are the aesthetic attachments that Genet has to these struggles, which he says very clearly in several places. He says that he doesn't believe that they're necessarily going to win, and if they do anytime soon. I mean, he says the Palestinians will regain Palestine, but after a long detour, which will oblige them to make or to provoke revolution in the entire Arab world. And I think that, there's a question of temporality that's being posed here, but there's also a very precise political observation, which is that the only possibility for Palestinian liberation is revolution in the entirety of the Arab world. And I think that that's as true then as it is now today.
Genet's obsession with beauty and with desperation has led to accusations of him being a racial fetishist, most famously in Kaji Amin's book, Disturbing Attachments. And Genet does at some point say that he approaches people because of their beauty and because he, as a gay man, thinks Arab men are very attractive. But I was wondering whether you find any kind of traction in that reading of Genet, that he is just this Orientalist and purveyor of Arab beauty and isn't really committed to them? Or do you think that's, as Said said in his writing, that allows him to approach these people, but his commitment is steadfast and he's, basically has intuited the whole scale of the drama of Palestine? I'm paraphrasing Edward Said here. Where do you lie?
Yeah, definitely. I wrote an article about this problem a couple of years ago that's called Experiments in Political Inheritance, where I basically, I tried to develop the problem that you just discussed, which is that there is a certain group of readers who see Genet as irrecuperable because of his racy comments, whether those are comments about the Algerian Revolution, about the Palestinians, about the Panthers, his obsession with David Hilliard and these different men in these liberation organizations. And then, a group of people who see him as this sort of model of a kind of white ally, And so what I wanted to do is to say that neither of these positions are useful in the present, and that the question of the utility of the present is something that I used as a marker or like a kind of criteria for thinking about Genet's legacy. Because you can read it many different ways. That's, you can interpret someone's life in the same way you can interpret their work. But I think that what makes Genet our contemporary is the way in which the complexity of his solidarity is something that can't be reduced to a sort of good position or a moral high ground or something like that. Because we've seen, I think, from the last 15 years of anti-racist struggles that a moral high ground is politically useless. We derive nothing from it, essentially. It has no real power and is deeply insignificant to combating the powers that be. So I think that was something that struck me. And I tried to argue that Genet, and this is related to Said's position, I think, but that Genet's openness, which might be a libidinal openness, is the catalyst for him to attempt a form of personal transformation in the encounter with the Palestinians and with the Panthers that leads to a real political project of some kind. And that project is maybe, only the upper limit of, solidarity or real solidarity. But I think when we read the texts that he writes about the Panthers and the Palestinians, that there's something incredible coming across to us that we can't get from, the propaganda of the time. And I certainly feel, many people feel that way about 4 Hours at Shatila, this text, which, his incredible witnessing of that horrific event. But it's true in reading his kind of, his text for Bobby Seale and the May Day speech that we've talked about before. He's not only doing the job of solidarity, but you can tell that he has really taken on the categories and the concepts that these people use and allowed those categories and concepts to transform his own ideas about politics. And that's why when you read something like the May Day speech, it seems so contemporary and so close to the ideas of the Panthers, in a way that when you read his texts on the Palestinians, where he's, concerned with questions about, the relationship of the revolution to religion and to God and Arab identity and all these are not his problems, but he takes them up, as a kind of challenge to thought. And I think that is an interesting way of doing solidarity ultimately.
This kind of ambiguity or ambivalence in Genet is much more generative than simply reading him as a straightforward ally or as a racial fetishist or Orientalist. Personally, I'm also really interested in how Genet straddles this question of the state and of borders, because this ambivalence feeds into that too. So on the one hand, of course, he hates the state. He writes so much about how much he hates the French state. And he's also, of course, deeply critical of US empire and the US state and of Arab states. But he comes down pretty strongly on Palestinian liberation in Shatila for sure, but also in Prisoner of Love towards the end. And he talks about how he finds himself in, I think, Shatila becoming Palestinian. And he wants national self-determination or liberation for the Palestinian people. That's what I get. When you read him, do you think that this kind of self-determination is based on merely liberated territory, or is it outside the state and the nation-state form? And perhaps what do you read in that question as well? So where would you stand on it when we think about Palestine today, but also other places?
Genet is interested in the truth of the struggle for the people who are living it, and not the truth of the struggle for the people who are observing it from the outside. And I think that is, in and of itself, a really precious reminder that, that there's something to always, it's worthwhile to always attempt to disambiguate between what others want for someone else's struggle and what the people who are actually conducting it want. And sometimes, especially around questions of the state, around questions of nation formation, which has, at least in the imperial countries in the past 15 or 20 years has become something of a consensus position against nationalism, right? There was that federal moment where everyone was writing books where they tried to say that decolonization wasn't about nationalism. And that seemed to me to be a symptom of a political wish on the part of the scholars in the imperialist countries to think that, the anti-colonial figures were not so naive as to believe that the nation was some kind of horizon, right? And the reality, I think, from taking an intellectual historical position, is that the anti-colonial thinkers did believe that the nation was a political horizon for them, and so we can judge that if we wish, but it's certainly not fair to rewrite their history based on the things that we want them to have thought or believed. And so I think that when you read Genet, you see, the question of the Palestinian nation, obviously, and the question of leadership, I think, which is very important to Genet. He's very interested in the way that leadership functions within the PLO. And then in the Panthers as well, of course, because he's only really interacting with the Panther leadership. And he wants to see in the leadership a kind of tenderness or a benevolence or a kind of movement towards a form of equality. That's how he speaks about the relationship between the leaders of the Palestinian struggle and the sort of ordinary soldiers. And he says this too about what he calls the ordinary women of the people of the Palestinian struggle, that there's a harmony happening between the leadership and the people. And this is a common theme in a lot of anti-colonial thinking at the time, but I think it's something that's really anathema to some of the ideas that we currently have on the left, right? Where there's a wish for horizontalism, and then a kind of historical revision that is enacted based on that wish. But I think that Genet, because he's interested in precisely being transformed by the ideas that he encounters in a context of radical difference, he's very willing to talk about both the Palestinian nation and the Black nation, right? He says in his text about the Panthers that America is going to destroy itself, sort of implode on its own corrupt and hypocritical contaminated substance, and that there's a Black nation underneath, right? And I think that this is something that's very current at the time, but again, things that are less interesting for people today, perhaps, than the idea of a kind of small vanguard of people who are trying to, create a new form of social relations. And I think, sure, in a certain way, they were trying to create a new form of social relations, but using the age-old idea of the nation and of vertical leadership. So I think that those are things that at least someone like Genet would, not at all be in a position to sort of rebuke or revise.
Yeah, absolutely. And for all his posturing or his seeming posturing, he does actually get behind the Socialist Party, for instance, in France of Mitterrand, and rebukes the communists for not seizing that moment and ultimately leading to a conservative victory. So instead of just being this agent of pure rebellion and chaos, as he's called, I think, by Clifford Geertz, he's actually quite strategic and interested in questions of strategy throughout, whichever movement he's supporting, whether it's the Palestinians, whether it's immigrant workers in France, and whether it's the Panthers in the US. He's quite clear-eyed, at least in his actions, if not always in his writings. And I guess that brings me to sort of my final question, which would be, what do you think his greatest legacy is? Or how do we, as Genetians, if that's a word, take some of that forward? I find him endlessly fascinating, and I every time I pick up something he's written to read, I learn so much from him, and his later writings are especially brimming with anacrity, I think. But I also sometimes find it difficult to take anything strategic, even though he is a strategic thinker, from it. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Something I was struck by recently was the political precision within his work. And I think that one of the reasons it's striking is because we don't expect such precision of what are, largely considered literary or artistic figures, right? There's a kind of, and I don't think that that's because there's some kind of misunderstanding. I think it's because it's rare that you would have someone who is a literary figure be able to become a student of and analyze a struggle that is so far away from his own experience. And we find also that Genet uses analogy a lot in this work. So he compares, the Hashemite monarchy to, the monarchy in France or something like that. And so there's a kind of, these wild analogies in a certain sense, maybe wouldn't pass in political theorizing, but I think they're honest in a certain way, because Genet is trying to understand sort of different levels of political reality. One of the legacies that I think, in relationship to your question, that we take from Genet is this capacity for him to learn from others. And I think that this is something that's really fascinating, is that, and Edward Said's text, I think, really points this out, right? That he says, for someone in the time period that Genet was alive, Palestine was the most dangerous choice. I think that's it. He frames it as this dangerous choice, and I think today it is still a very, very dangerous choice. It's definitely much more dangerous than, being an ally of other anti-colonial struggles that are ongoing. But I think that he also came to that struggle with a kind of humility that I think a lot of people in the imperialist countries could learn from. He put himself to, in the service of that struggle in a way that he wasn't trying to get anything out of it. He wasn't trying to make himself feel better about the situation. And I think that there's something really compelling about that, which makes his legacy now appear to us as useful, because if that wasn't the case, then it wouldn't be useful to us at all, I think. And secondly, I think that, this is what really intrigued me and led to writing the article I wrote about the questions of sexuality, but that, our solidarities are very tricky, right? And I think that taking, someone like Genet, who is, whose life, it was centered around forms of sexual transgression, that were meant to absolutely provoke others and were meant to create a kind of scandal that he believed was not a political project, but an artistic project. And then to conjugate that type of person with something that is so different and so distant, that to me is something that I feel like our current moment is uncomfortable with, right? The idea that you could take someone who is completely alien to a situation and see the ways in which they are transformed in the way that they are able to understand, right? And able to give themselves over to a certain dynamic. And I think that this is really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really great and thought-provoking note to end on the kind of transformational but thorny and tricky nature of solidarity, and how to forge solidarity in spite of differences, and to keep trying even when it becomes hard, which I also would agree is Genet's greatest legacy and gifts to us. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. This episode has been brought to you by Surviving Society Productions. To support our work, like, review and subscribe. Follow us on Instagram, Blue Sky and Patreon.